Hi everybody, my name is Henry Zeller, and I'll be doing my Teached article presentation today on Both Sides of the Story, History, Education, and Post-Apartheid South Africa by Chana Teeger. So a summary of the article. In this article, Teeger takes an investigatory study into two secondary level high schools which perform among the best in South Africa, both in terms of test scores and being racially diverse, which makes it the perfect candidates for her particular study. The author notes that there's still a subtle racist environment that exists in South Africa post-apartheid, and through observation and in-depth interviews with students and teachers, she's going to seek to find out what is being taught in public schools about apartheid to the first born free students post-apartheid, and analyzes the impact of the lessons being taught. So moving on to her thesis. Through the discourse in classrooms that see educators teaching apartheid history from what she calls both sides of the argument or story, Teeger is arguing that South African education system has kind of sought to deny both present-day racism and the lasting effects apartheid's oppression has instilled in Black South Africans. And she especially notes how this type of education is socializing a form of colorblind racism, which we'll get into later in this presentation. So the educational system is just a part of this problem that has existed post-apartheid. There's several main arguments that she makes throughout her thing. Number one is she says that both sides of the argument or story says that not all whites were perpetrators in the oppressive apartheid regime, and number two, not all Black South Africans were victims. Now she says that colorblind racism, which is a result of this type of rhetoric in schools, says that she says that it has already taken shape in South Africa post-apartheid, meaning that people claim they do not see color. Now, why has this happened? She says, number one, they identify the reconfiguration and rearticulation of racist attitudes in an era when explicit forms of racist discourse have become less acceptable. So in other words, it's becoming less acceptable to be racist. And then number two, they point to the racist consequences of these discourses in protecting racially unequal status quo from challenge. So at the same time, they're preventing challenge to the system that has been created in post-South Africa. Now, when shifting from apartheid to democracy, Teeger says that South Africa focused on individual rather than collective blame. And Teeger feels that this sentiment is seen clearly in classrooms when discussion is had on responsibility for apartheid. And she believed that going into classrooms would help prove the colorblind issue is being socialized into South Africans and especially young students. Now, there's several things in the article that support the argument or the thesis. In every classroom, she notes that both sides of the story came up as part of the curriculum, and teachers would state that all races struggled under apartheid, not just Black Africans. They would also say that some whites disagree with apartheid and some Black Africans supported it. Now, by forcing students to see apartheid from this perspective, or from many perspectives, many teachers actually believe they were preventing racial conflict or helping white students in their classrooms not feel guilty. Now, while it was argued in every classroom that not all whites support apartheid, it was always failed to mention that the white electorate repeatedly voted this apartheid regime into government, and they were the only ones that were able to vote. Meanwhile, they were benefiting from the apartheid system. And other teachers tried to argue that white people were ignorant to what was going on. Now, some also argue that white people were victims also, which I found to be completely unbelievable. But they would say that because they couldn't marry Africans or Black Africans if they wanted, or they couldn't mingle within that race, they were also victims under the apartheid system. They also used the violence perpetrated by the Pan-Africanist Congress, or the PAC, to paint white people as victims in certain situations, basically equating their wrongdoings while protesting apartheid to apartheid itself, which is unfair. And many students actually point this out to the teachers and were met with outrage by their teachers. And Teeger states that the argument pitted apartheid as two groups who hated each other rather than one group oppressing the other. Now, in most cases, after the apartheid unit, students stated in interviews that their biggest takeaway from the lessons was that Black people were not the only victims of apartheid. And they're basically repeating the same two sides of the story BS that their teachers are teaching them in school. And so you can see how that's getting socialized into students. And then how does this like relate to the civil rights movement, especially with apartheid? This article doesn't talk so much about other historians specifically, but rather analyzes the teaching of history and educators themselves. So looking at teachers as the historians. And we can draw connections about how the wrongs of oppression are handled post-civil rights movement. There are the contributions that Teeger feels her work makes. Two specifically. Number one, recounting histories of racial oppression through the trope of both sides of the story can become a mechanism for denying the effects of the past and promoting color blindness in the present. And number two, in outlining the microsocial considerations that led teachers to deploy this narrative in the face-to-face setting of classroom interactions, they add to our knowledge of the uses and functions of this color blindness or racism that is existing post-apartheid. I have three anecdotes here. There were plenty that the author chose to include throughout the presentation, but I found these to be specifically noteworthy. So number one, in answering why this particular student considered Nelson Mandela was the most important figure in South African history, this person stated, he was able to forgive and put his life on hold for everyone. He was able to forgive everyone for the commotion that was caused. Because I can't only say white people were the cause of everything. Number two, I think we were all victimized and oppressed, actually, because not only the other races, but like whites also didn't get to grow up with other races and stuff. A Black African student said that in the interview with Teeger. And trying to justify white people during apartheid, Mrs. Devon, who was a white teacher in one of the schools that Teeger observed, stated, "It's true. There were white people who fought against apartheid. I remember I spoke to my mom once about it, and she said she didn't know what was going on. And I said, how is that possible? And she said it was basically not in the newspapers, and her family shielded her from it." Now you can see how these people have been literally brainwashed from this educational system of the both sides of the argument. Get this out of your way. The most interesting fact that I've learned from this, that I didn't already know, I guess, is the outgoing apartheid regime wanted complete immunity, of course, when the democratic government was taking over, but members of anti-apartheid organizations insisted on accountability. The compromise was individual immunity conditional on the admission of full disclosure of past wrongdoings. Now, the Truth Reconciliation Committee, or the TRC, was created, and then they were given the authority to grant amnesty to individuals whose fully disclosed crimes were being proved to be politically motivated. The TRC controversially required apartheid-resistant groups to apply for amnesty for human rights violations as well. Now you can see how this is problematic because, again, this is like what the teachers were teaching. They're equating resistance to apartheid as an equal crime to apartheid itself. So that's super problematic. And this is the end of basically my presentation. I have a couple discussion questions. We can discuss all of them or one of them. But number one is, do you see any connections between post-apartheid South Africa and their handling of the racial relations in the United States after our civil rights movement? And then how about Northern Ireland? Might be a little bit different than racial, but do you see connections to how things were handled post-civil rights movement there? And do teachers have the responsibility to tell the whole truth or protect their students from conflict? And then number three, how would you teach a white student about apartheid who is struggling with guilt about the way his or her ancestors behaved? And this was a problem that came up a lot in Teeger's interviews with teachers. So I was just wondering what your guys' input is on that. So thank you so much for listening. Let me know if you have any questions.